There's a word that has been completely ruined. Not by science, not by religion, by certainty. The word is manifestation, and the problem isn't that people believe in it. The problem is that they believe in a version of it that has been scrubbed clean of everything that makes it real, everything that makes it dangerous, everything that should keep you up at night, not because it's hopeless, but because it's already working. Right now, whether you want it to or not. Here's what nobody tells you. The terrifying version of manifestation isn't the one where it doesn't work. The terrifying version is the one where it does, and has been, your entire life, without your permission. Think about the patterns you can't seem to escape, the relationships that follow the same invisible script, the opportunities that appear and then dissolve in exactly the same way they dissolved before. The version of yourself that shows up under pressure, the one you swore you replaced 10 years ago, maybe 20. Most people explain these patterns through luck, through timing, through the quality of the people around them. A smaller group decides to try harder, visualize more clearly, repeat better affirmations in front of a bathroom mirror. But what if the pattern isn't a mistake? What if it's an output? Not in the vague metaphorical sense that self-help uses the word, in the precise, almost mechanical sense that a physicist would recognize. A result. Something being generated by something else consistently because the underlying system hasn't changed, because the thing doing the generating hasn't changed. That's the thread this video is going to pull. And I want to be clear about where it leads, because it doesn't lead to comfort. It leads to a specific kind of clarity that is, at first, deeply uncomfortable. The kind that makes you realize you've been the author of something you were certain was happening to you. That realization lands differently depending on where you are in life. If you're younger, it might feel like an invitation. If you've been walking this earth for 4 or 5 or 6 decades, if you've accumulated real losses, real evidence that certain things simply don't change, real exhaustion from trying, that realization doesn't feel like an invitation. It feels like an indictment. And that's exactly why this conversation is worth having. Because the alternative, the cleaned-up, commodified version of manifestation that promises alignment in 30 days, that attributes your patterns to insufficient belief or impure vibration, that version is not only useless, it's insulting. It takes the full complexity of a human life and treats it like a software bug. It suggests the reason you're still circling the same problems is that you haven't wanted it badly enough. That's not a spiritual teaching. That's blame with better branding. What I'm interested in is something older, something that predates the self-help industry by about a century and predates any single tradition's ownership of inner transformation by considerably more. Something physicists stumbled into when they were trying to understand subatomic particles and discovered to their considerable alarm that the universe did not behave the way a universe was supposed to behave when nobody was watching. The word manifestation is wrong, not because the phenomenon it points at isn't real, but because it isn't strong enough. It doesn't carry the weight of what's actually being described. What's being described is participation. You are not a passive receiver of a reality that unfolds independently of your presence. Something in the structure of how the universe operates, something that physicists have been formally arguing about since 1927 and have not resolved, suggests that the observer and the observed are not cleanly separate, that you, in some sense still being debated at the highest levels of theoretical physics, are part of what determines what shows up. That should terrify you. Not because it means you're doing something wrong, because it means you've been doing something continuously, automatically, without awareness, that has been shaping your experience of reality in ways you never consciously chose. And here's the first thing this video will leave open deliberately, because it has no clean answer yet. If you've been observing reality your entire life, and observation participates in what gets generated, who exactly has been doing the observing? Not the version of you that makes plans, not the version of you that sets intentions or writes goals in a journal. Something older, something quieter, something that formed long before you had the language to question it. We'll come back to that. But first, we need to understand what physicists actually found, because the popular version of quantum mechanics and manifestation has almost no relationship to the thing that actually kept those physicists awake at night. In 1927, a group of the most rigorous minds in the history of science gathered in Brussels, for what became known as the Solvay Conference. Einstein was there, Bohr was there, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Pauli, the entire architecture of modern physics was in that room. And they were, by most accounts, genuinely unsettled by what they had found. Not unsettled in the dramatic sense, unsettled in the way that very precise people get unsettled when the math works perfectly and the implications are unacceptable. What they had found was this. At the subatomic level, the level of electrons, photons, the fundamental constituents of everything you can see and touch and call real, particles don't behave like objects. They behave like possibilities. A particle, before it is measured, doesn't have a definite position. It exists in what physicists call a superposition, a word meaning it occupies multiple possible states simultaneously, described by a mathematical structure called a wave function. The wave function isn't a description of our ignorance about where the particle is. It's a description of what the particle actually is before measurement, a spread of probabilities, not a fixed thing in a fixed location. Then something happens. You measure it, you observe it, and the wave function collapses, meaning the spread of possibilities resolves into a single actuality. The particle is now here, not spread across everywhere it could have been. This position, not the others. The question that fractured the Solvay Conference and that has never been formally resolved is deceptively simple. What causes the collapse? What is it about measurement, about observation, that transforms possibility into actuality? This isn't a philosophical question they imported from outside the physics. The mathematics itself forced it on them, and the answers that were proposed and are still being proposed today range from the conservative to the genuinely reality-dissolving. The Copenhagen interpretation, championed by Niels Bohr, essentially said, don't ask. The wave function is a tool for predicting measurement outcomes. What happens between measurements is not a meaningful question. This became the dominant position in physics departments for most of the 20th century, and when you examine it honestly, it is a form of institutionalized agnosticism. It says the math works, the predictions are accurate, stop asking what it means. Einstein couldn't accept it. Not because he was wrong about the equations, he wasn't, but because he believed with something close to philosophical conviction that reality must be independent of observation, that the moon exists when nobody is looking at it, that particles have definite positions whether or not anyone measures them. He spent the last 30 years of his life trying to prove that quantum mechanics was incomplete, that there were hidden variables, deeper layers of reality that would restore the clean separation between observer and observed. He never found them. In 1964, a physicist named John Bell proved mathematically that any theory based on local hidden variables, any theory designed to rescue Einstein's vision of observer-independent reality, makes predictions that differ from standard quantum mechanics. Then in the 1980s, experiments by Alain Aspect confirmed it experimentally. The correlations between particles are too strong, too immediate, too indifferent to distance to be explained by anything pre-existing inside the particles themselves. Reality, at its most fundamental level, does not appear to be settled in advance. Now here is where the popular version of this story goes badly wrong, and why it matters for everything that follows. The self-help appropriation of quantum physics takes this finding and makes a leap the physics doesn't support. It says that because the observer affects the quantum level, human consciousness directly reshapes macroscopic reality, that your thoughts literally rearrange the physical world, that if you hold a clear enough image of what you want, the quantum field will conspire to deliver it. This is not what the physics says. The observer in quantum mechanics is not necessarily a conscious mind. It can be any physical interaction, a detector, a photon colliding with a surface, a stray air molecule transferring energy. The collapse of the wave function doesn't require awareness. It requires interaction. The two things are not the same, and collapsing that distinction is where the pop version loses its integrity entirely. But here's what's strange. Here's what the pop version throws away in its rush to be reassuring. The real version is more interesting, and considerably more unsettling. In the 1970s and 1980s, physicist John Archibald Wheeler, one of the most decorated theoretical physicists of the 20th century, the man who coined the term black hole and worked directly with both Einstein and Bohr, began developing what he called the participatory universe. Wheeler wasn't a mystic. He wasn't building a brand. He was following the internal logic of quantum mechanics to its conclusion, and the conclusion unsettled him enough that he spent decades trying to articulate it with precision. His position was this: it is not that consciousness creates reality in the naive sense. It is that the universe is in some deep structural way participatory. Observers, and he meant this in the broadest possible sense, not limited to human minds, are not incidental to the cosmos. They are constitutive of it. The universe, Wheeler argued, could not have become the specific, structured universe it is without the presence of observers within it to participate in the process of collapsing possibility into actuality. He called it a self-excited circuit. The universe gives rise to observers. Observers participate in collapsing quantum states. Those collapsed states become the physical substrate, the atoms, molecules, structures that give rise to more observers. The loop has no clean outside. There is no view from nowhere. There is no version of reality that exists fully formed, independent of any participation whatsoever. Now I want to slow down here, because something important just happened in this argument, and it's easy to miss it. We are not talking about wishful thinking. We are not talking about the law of attraction as a motivational reframe. We are talking about a structural property of reality that some of the most rigorous scientific minds of the last century have been unable to dismiss. Not because it's comforting, but because the mathematics keeps pointing at it, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes everyone in the room. What does this mean philosophically? It means the hard boundary between subject and object, between the one who looks and the thing being looked at, is not as solid as common sense assumes. This is not a new idea in philosophy. Immanuel Kant argued in the 18th century that the mind doesn't simply receive reality passively, it actively structures experience through the categories it brings to perception. We don't experience raw reality. We experience reality as filtered and organized by the apparatus of the mind doing the experiencing. Kant called these filters a priori categories, meaning prior to experience, built into the structure of how we perceive before any specific perception occurs. Time, space, causality, these aren't features you discover in the world. They're features your mind imposes on the world in order to make experience coherent. Quantum mechanics didn't invent this problem. It inherited it from philosophy and then made it unavoidable in the language of physics. And here is the micro payoff for this block, stated plainly. The observer effect, the fact that observation participates in determining what is observed, is not a quirk of the quantum level that disappears when you scale up to ordinary life. It is a structural feature of how any knowing system relates to any reality it tries to know. You are a knowing system. You have been observing reality your entire life. And if observation is participatory at the level of physics, and if the philosophical tradition from Kant onward has been arguing that the mind structures experience rather than simply receiving it, then the question that opens directly ahead of us is not whether your observation shapes your reality. The question is, how? And more precisely, which part of you is doing the observing? And when did that part form? That's the problem this block can't close. Because answering it requires going somewhere the physics alone can't take us. It didn't. And the reason it didn't is more revealing than the experiment itself. In 1909, Jeffrey Ingram Taylor performed a version of the double-slit experiment, the foundational demonstration of quantum strangeness, using light so dim that only one photon at a time passed through the apparatus. The expectation was straightforward. If you send particles one by one, you get a particle pattern on the detection screen. Dots accumulating in two bands, one behind each slit. Clean, mechanical, predictable. That's not what happened. Even with one photon at a time, the interference pattern, the pattern that only makes sense if a wave is passing through both slits simultaneously and interfering with itself, still appeared on the screen. A single particle, with nothing to interfere with, was somehow interfering with itself, as if it had passed through both slits at once, as if, in the absence of a measurement telling it which slit to use, it had used all available possibilities simultaneously. Then physicists added a detector at the slits, a device to determine which path the photon actually took. the interference pattern disappeared, not diminished, not slightly altered, gone. The act of measuring which path the photon took was sufficient to destroy the quantum behavior entirely. The photon, once observed in transit, stopped behaving like a wave of possibilities and started behaving like a particle with a definite history. Richard Feynman, who may have understood quantum mechanics more intuitively than anyone who has ever lived, said this about the double-slit experiment: "It contains the only mystery of quantum mechanics. Everything else," he argued, "is a consequence of this one deeply strange fact." But the experiment that should genuinely restructure how you think about observation wasn't performed in 1909. It was proposed by John Wheeler in 1978 and confirmed experimentally in 1984, and then again with increasing precision in the decades that followed. Wheeler called it the delayed choice experiment. The setup is a refinement of the double slit. A photon is fired toward a beam splitter, a device that gives it a 50-50 probability of taking one of two paths through the apparatus. At the end of both paths, the experimenter can choose, after the photon has already entered the apparatus, whether to insert a second beam splitter that allows the two paths to recombine and interfere, or to leave it out and simply detect which path the photon took. When the second beam splitter is inserted, the photon behaves as if it traveled both paths simultaneously, producing interference. When it's removed, the photon behaves as if it chose one definite path from the beginning. The decision about how to measure is made after. The photon has already committed to its journey through the apparatus, and the photon's behavior, whether it behaved like a wave traveling both paths or a particle traveling one, appears to retroactively conform to the measurement choice that hasn't been made yet. Read that again, slowly. The photon's past behavior appears to be determined by a future measurement decision. Wheeler's interpretation was not that this proved backwards causation in the naive sense. His interpretation was subtler and more radical. The past is not fully real until it is registered by an observer in the present. Reality at the quantum level doesn't crystallize into a definite history until some participatory act of observation, fixes it. He used a striking illustration. He pointed to the light from quasars, objects billions of light years away, whose light has been traveling toward us for billions of years, bent and split by the gravitational lensing of intervening galaxies. That ancient light, in Wheeler's analysis, doesn't have a definite path history until it reaches a telescope on Earth and is registered. The measurement we make today, in some sense that the mathematics supports even when the intuition revolts against it, participates in determining the path that light took billions of years ago. The universe, Wheeler concluded, is not a machine that runs independently and produces observers as a late byproduct. It is a system in which observers are required to bring the past into definite existence. Now, this is the point where careful thinking has to hold two things simultaneously, because the alternative is falling into either dismissal or overclaim. On one side, none of this proves that human consciousness is a magical force that reshapes the macroscopic world by intention. The scales involved in quantum mechanics are fantastically small. The gap between a collapsing wave function and a collapsing marriage is not a gap the physics closes on its own. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. On the other side, dismissing the participatory dimension of reality entirely, retreating to the comfortable Newtonian picture of a universe that runs like clockwork, independent of any observer, is a position the 20th century's most careful experiments have made increasingly difficult to defend. The evidence doesn't support the mystical overclaim, but it also doesn't support the materialist underclaim that observation is entirely passive and irrelevant. What it supports is something in between, something more uncomfortable than either extreme. And this is where history becomes useful, because this tension isn't new. It has appeared in different vocabularies across cultures and centuries in the work of people who had no access to quantum mechanics, but were following the same thread through different material. The Stoic philosophers of ancient Greece and Rome, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, built an entire practical philosophy around a single distinction that maps surprisingly well onto what Wheeler was describing 2,000 years later. They called it the distinction between ta f hemin and ta uk f hemin, what is up to us and what is not up to us. But the deeper version of this teaching the one that gets lost in the modern appropriation of Stoicism as productivity advice, is not just about controlling your reactions. It's about recognizing that the faculty of judgment, what the Stoics called hegemonikon, the ruling part of the mind, is the lens through which all of reality is processed. And that lens is not neutral. It is not a clean window. It is a shaped instrument that has been ground and polished by every experience, every assumption, every conclusion you ever drew about how the world works and what you should expect from it. The Stoics weren't doing physics, but they were pointing at the same structural problem Wheeler formalized. The observer is not separate from what is observed. The instrument of perception shapes the perception. Move forward roughly 18 centuries, and you find the philosopher Immanuel Kant making the same argument with greater technical precision. Kant's revolution, what he called his Copernican turn in philosophy, was the recognition that the mind doesn't conform to objects. Objects, as we experience them, conform to the mind. The categories through which we perceive reality, causality, space, time, quantity, are not features we discover in the world. They are features the mind projects onto raw experience in order to make it coherent. Kant wasn't saying the external world doesn't exist. He was saying we never have access to it directly. We have access only to the world as it appears through the apparatus of our own cognition. And that apparatus, crucially, is not the same for everyone. Move forward another century, and you find William James, the American philosopher and psychologist who essentially founded the scientific study of consciousness, arguing that attention is the most powerful act a human being performs. Not effort, not willpower, attention. Because what you attend to is what becomes real for you, and what becomes real for you is what your life is made of. James wrote in 1890 that the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. He was describing in the language of early psychology what Wheeler would later describe in the language of physics. The act of directed observation is constitutive. It doesn't just register reality, it participates in generating it. And then there is the neuroscience. In the 1990s, researchers studying the brain's sensory processing systems discovered something that should have been front-page news, but was mostly confined to academic journals. The brain receives roughly 11 million bits of information per second from the environment. The conscious mind processes approximately 50 bits out of 11 million. The rest is filtered, suppressed, or never reaches awareness at all. And the system that performs this filtering, selecting which 50 bits make it through, is not random. It is governed by what neuroscientists call the reticular activating system, a network of neurons in the brainstem that acts as a gatekeeper of attention. The reticular activating system is tuned by relevance, and relevance is determined by prior experience, prior belief, prior emotional investment. In plain language, your brain is not showing you reality. It is showing you a highly edited version of reality, filtered through a system that has been calibrated by everything you've already concluded about what matters, what's possible, and what to expect. This is not a metaphor. This is the structural mechanism by which your past shapes your present. Not through fate, not through mystical resonance, but through the literal architecture of how your nervous system processes the world. The physicist, the stoic, the philosopher, and the neuroscientist are all pointing at the same room from different doors. And in that room sits a question that none of them can fully answer alone. If your observation of reality is filtered by what you've already concluded, if the reticular activating system is selecting which 50 bits of 11 million reach your awareness based on prior calibration, then who calibrated it, when, and on what evidence? That's the question that closes this block and opens the next one, because the evidence suggests the calibration happened early, much earlier than you can consciously remember, and it has been running, largely unexamined ever since. This resolves the question of whether observation participates in shaping experience. The physics, the philosophy, the neuroscience, they converge on yes, but it creates a problem considerably larger than the one it solves. If your observation has been shaped by a filter you didn't consciously choose, then what you've been calling your life, your patterns, your results, your recurring losses and recurring ceilings, may be less a reflection of the world as it is, and more a reflection of the world as your filter expects it to be. Not the world, your model of the world, and models, unlike the world, can be wrong. Let's bring this somewhere specific. You've probably heard the phrase self-fulfilling prophecy. It entered common language through sociologist Robert Merton in 1948, and it has since been domesticated into a piece of motivational vocabulary that lost most of its original force in the process. Merton wasn't describing positive thinking. He was describing something far more disturbing. The mechanism by which a false belief about reality, acted upon as if it were true, generates the very evidence that confirms it, making it functionally true even though it started as a mistake. His original example was a bank run. If enough people believe a bank is failing, they withdraw their money simultaneously, and the bank actually fails, not because it was failing, but because the belief that it was failing created the behavior that made it fail. The belief generated the reality it predicted. Now apply that mechanism not to a bank, but to a person, specifically to you. Somewhere in your history, and for most people reading this, that somewhere is childhood, adolescence, or early adulthood, in the years before the prefrontal cortex finished developing and gave you the capacity for genuine self-reflection. You drew conclusions, not minor conclusions, foundational ones, about whether you are the kind of person things work out for, about whether effort leads to results, or whether the game is rigged before you arrive, about whether other people can be trusted to stay, about whether you deserve the version of life you actually want, or whether wanting it too openly is a form of arrogance that invites punishment. These conclusions didn't arrive as conclusions. They arrived as experiences. A parent who was consistently unavailable, a success that was met with indifference instead of recognition, a failure that was treated as evidence of permanent inadequacy rather than temporary setback, a relationship that ended in a way that seemed to confirm something you'd already suspected about yourself. Each of these experiences didn't just happen, they were interpreted, and the interpretation became a lens, and the lens became the filter through which every subsequent experience was processed. Here is where it gets specific. Here is where this stops being abstract. Think about the last time you encountered an opportunity, professional, relational, creative, that genuinely excited you. Something that felt real, not just theoretically desirable. Now think about what happened in the hours or days after that excitement first appeared. For many people, what follows is a familiar sequence: initial energy, then a quiet but insistent inner voice cataloging the reasons it probably won't work, then a gradual cooling of engagement, then a half-hearted execution that almost guarantees the disappointing result that the inner voice predicted. This is not weakness, this is not lack of desire. This is your filter operating exactly as designed, protecting you from the specific kind of disappointment it was calibrated years ago to prevent. The filter doesn't know that the situation has changed. It doesn't know that you've changed. It only knows the original lesson, and it applies that lesson with perfect consistency, regardless of whether the lesson still applies. That is not a character flaw. That is a feature of the system behaving exactly as designed. But here's what makes it genuinely difficult to see from the inside. The filter doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, "I am now applying a 20-year-old conclusion to this new situation." It simply shapes what you notice, what you emphasize, what you remember, and what you dismiss, and then presents the result to your conscious mind as reality, as just the way things are, as evidence, and you reasonably believe the evidence. This is why intelligent people with genuine insight into themselves, people who have done years of therapy or spiritual practice or honest self-examination, can still find themselves circling the same patterns, not because they lack understanding, but because understanding by itself operates at the level of the conscious mind, and the filter doesn't live there. The filter lives in what you do automatically, in what you reach for when you're tired or stressed or unguarded, in the tone of voice you default to in conflict, in the specific way you sabotage things that are going well. And if you're honest, you know exactly what that looks like for you, even if you've never named it directly. Let me be more specific. For people who grew up in environments where emotional needs were consistently unmet, not necessarily through cruelty, often simply through absence or distraction, the filter tends to calibrate toward one of two poles. Either it learns to expect disappointment from closeness, and begins unconsciously creating distance before the other person can create it first. Or it learns to pursue closeness with such intensity that it generates exactly the withdrawal it feared. Different behaviors, same filter, same original conclusion. People leave, or people disappear, or people are unreliable, and the best I can do is manage that fact rather than change it. For people who grew up in environments where success or visibility was dangerous, where achieving too much invited criticism, envy, or the withdrawal of love, the filter calibrates toward a ceiling. Not an external ceiling, an internal one, the kind that produces a person who consistently performs at about 70% of their actual capacity, who almost makes it, who has a pattern of arriving at the edge of something significant and finding reliably a reason it isn't the right time. These aren't random patterns, they are precise outputs of a precisely calibrated system, and here is what the quantum framework adds to this psychological picture. Something that pure psychology on its own doesn't quite capture. It isn't just that the filter shapes your behavior, and your behavior produces outcomes. It's that the filter shapes your observation, which means it shapes which aspects of a situation you register at all, which signals you amplify and which you suppress, which interpretations feel obvious and which feel forced, which possibilities appear available to you and which appear foreclosed. You are not just acting from a filtered belief, you are seeing from it. And what you see, the specific edited 50 bits out of 11 million that your reticular activating system delivers to your conscious awareness, is what you treat as the real situation, the full situation, the truth of what's happening, which means the pattern doesn't just repeat because of what you do, it repeats because of what you see. And what you see confirms the filter, and the confirmed filter continues to shape what you see. And the loop runs quietly, continuously, beneath the level of conscious intention, regardless of how many books you've read or seminars you've attended or sincere resolutions you've made on New Year's Eve or in the first week after something fell apart. This is the pattern, named finally not as bad luck or personal failing, but as a system doing exactly what systems do, reproducing its own conditions. And that naming, as clarifying as it is, creates a problem larger than the one it solves. Because if the pattern is systemic, recognition alone won't break it. You can see a loop clearly and still be inside it. You can understand, intellectually and even emotionally, that your filter is distorting your perception and still perceive through it, because seeing the filter and seeing through the filter are two entirely different operations. Something deeper has to change. And that question, what exactly has to change and at what level, is what the next part of this conversation is built to answer. Carl Jung spent the better part of his career trying to name something that resisted naming. He called it the shadow, der Schatten, in his native German. But the word has been so thoroughly absorbed into pop psychology that it now carries almost the opposite of its original meaning. In popular usage, the shadow is simply the collection of negative traits you're ashamed of, the anger you hide, the envy you won't admit, the selfishness you dress up as something more presentable. Fix those, the popular version implies, and you're done. Jung meant something considerably more radical. The shadow, in Jung's original formulation, is not just what you dislike about yourself. It is everything that lies outside the boundary of what you've defined as self. Everything the ego, the conscious identity you've constructed and maintained with considerable effort, has rejected, suppressed, or simply never developed. And crucially, the shadow is not passive. It does not sit quietly in the basement of the psyche waiting to be discovered. It operates, it acts, it makes decisions, it shapes behavior, particularly in moments of stress, fatigue, intimacy, and ambition, from below the threshold of conscious awareness. Jung's most unsettling claim was this: the things you most insistently believe you would never do, the reactions you're certain you've outgrown, the patterns you've identified in others and vowed never to repeat. These are frequently the precise locations of the shadow's greatest influence. Not because you're a hypocrite, because the more firmly you've rejected something from conscious identity, the more completely it operates outside conscious control. What you refuse to own, owns you. And this is where Jung's psychology and Wheeler's physics arrive at the same address from opposite directions. Wheeler's participatory observer is the entity whose act of observation participates in collapsing quantum possibility into specific actuality. Jung's shadow is the entity whose unconscious orientation participates in collapsing the infinite possibilities of a given situation into the specific, recurring pattern that your life keeps producing. Not the conscious you, not the intentional you. The observer beneath the observer, the self you haven't met yet, or more accurately, the self you've met and rejected again and again, because what it carries is too uncomfortable to integrate. Now let's add a third layer, because Jung and Wheeler together are still not quite complete. In the last 2 decades, neuroscience and cognitive science have converged on a framework called predictive coding, sometimes called predictive processing, that may be the most significant revision to our understanding of perception since Kant. The central claim is this: the brain is not primarily a device for receiving and processing sensory information, it is primarily a prediction machine. At every moment, your brain is generating a model of what it expects to encounter, based on prior experience, prior pattern, prior emotional salience, and it is comparing incoming sensory data against that model. What gets through to conscious awareness is not raw reality. It is the difference between what the brain predicted and what actually arrived. The prediction itself, the model, largely doesn't reach awareness. It operates as the invisible background assumption against which experience is measured. Carl Friston, the neuroscientist who has done the most rigorous mathematical work on this framework, describes perception as a process of inference rather than detection. You are not detecting the world. You are inferring it, continuously, automatically, based on a model that your brain has built from everything that has come before. And the model is updated only when prediction errors are large enough and persistent enough to force a revision. The implications of this for everything we've been discussing are significant enough that I want to state them plainly. If perception is inference, if what you experience as reality is primarily a projection of your brain's predictive model onto incoming sensory data, then your experience of any given situation is shaped more by what your brain expects to find than by what is actually there. Not entirely. The prediction errors do get through. Reality does push back. But the model has a profound gravitational pull on what gets registered as signal and what gets dismissed as noise. And the model, like the filter, like the shadow, like the calibrated reticular activating system, was built largely in the past. From past experiences, past conclusions, past emotional responses that were accurate to specific situations that no longer exist applied to present situations that only superficially resemble them. This is the mechanism, not metaphor, not spiritual shorthand. The literal neurological mechanism by which the past colonizes the present, by which a person can walk into a genuinely new situation and experience it as a variation of something that already happened, because the brain's predictive model is generating an experience more consistent with history than with what's actually in the room. And here is where the terror of quantum manifestation becomes fully visible. Not the terror of doing something wrong. The terror of recognizing that the entity doing the manifesting, the observer, whose participation collapses possibility into actuality, whose filter selects which 50 bits of 11 million reach awareness, whose predictive model generates the expected world and finds it, that entity is not your conscious intention. It is your accumulated history, operating as a perceptual system. Your desires, your goals, your sincere resolutions, these operate at the level of conscious intention. But the observer that participates in shaping your experience of reality operates at the level of the model. And the model is older, faster, more pervasive, and considerably more powerful than conscious intention. This is why willpower fails chronically at the level of deep pattern, not because you lack commitment, because willpower is a conscious level tool being applied to a pre-conscious level problem. It is the wrong instrument for the depth of the work required. William James understood this. He wrote that habit is the flywheel of society, and by flywheel he meant not a metaphor for comfort, but a precise mechanical description of a system that stores momentum and resists change. The deeper the groove of a habit, the more energy is required not just to stop it, but to redirect it. And the habits we're discussing here are not surface behaviors. They are perceptual habits, habits of expectation, habits of interpretation, habits of attention so deeply embedded that they feel like facts about reality rather than choices about how to engage with it. Jung called the process of integrating the shadow individuation, a word that in German carries the specific sense of becoming undivided, of bringing into conscious relationship the parts of the self that have been operating in exile. He was clear that this is not a comfortable process. It is not achieved through insight alone, though insight begins it. It requires sustained confrontation with the parts of the self you've organized your identity around not being. The Stoics called it prosoche, attention to the self, continuous watchfulness of the inner movement of judgment before it becomes action, not self-criticism, not performance review, a quality of inner listening that catches the filter in the act of filtering, the model in the act of predicting, before the prediction hardens into perceived reality. And the neuroscience, in its own vocabulary, describes the same process as generating prediction error deliberately, exposing the predictive model to experiences that contradict it, persistently, and in contexts of sufficient safety that the brain can register the contradiction as information rather than threat, and slowly, through repetition of disconfirming experience, update the model toward greater accuracy. None of these traditions is describing a quick process. None of them is describing a technique. They are describing a reorientation, a shift not in what you do but in what you are while you're doing it, in the quality of presence you bring to your own experience, the degree to which you can observe your observer, catch your filtering, and introduce the possibility of something other than what the model predicts. This is what genuine change looks like at the level where these patterns actually live. Not new behavior grafted onto an old model. A revised model that generates different behavior naturally because the perception that drives behavior has changed. And here, right at the edge of this understanding, is where the second peak of this conversation lands. Not with a solution, with a precise description of the problem. The observer you need to change is not accessible through the same observational capacity that generated it. You cannot think your way to a different thinker. You cannot perceive your way to a different perceiver using only the perceptual tools the current perceiver has available. Something has to interrupt the circuit, not from outside. Nothing from outside is strong enough to override a model this deeply embedded, but from a level of awareness that is prior to the model itself. A quality of attention that can witness the prediction being made without being identical to the predictor. That capacity exists. Every tradition that has investigated it seriously, from Stoic prosoche to Buddhist mindfulness, to the Jungian confrontation with shadow, to the neuroscientific practice of metacognitive awareness, arrives at the same functional description. There is a dimension of consciousness that can observe the observer, that can witness the filter without being the filter, that can catch the prediction in the act of predicting and introduce, in that brief gap between stimulus and interpretation, the possibility of a different response. The Buddhists call it sati, mindfulness, but in the original Pali sense of clear recollection of the present moment, not the diluted wellness industry version, the Stoics called it the hegemonikon in action, the ruling faculty exercising its capacity to pause, to examine the impression before assenting to it. Jung called it the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold the tension between conscious identity and shadow content without collapsing into either. Different vocabularies, the same aperture. And what all of them agree on, what makes this the most important point in this entire conversation, is that this capacity is not something you develop by trying harder at the level you're already operating at. It develops through a specific quality of repeated practice that is less about effort and more about orientation, less about forcing a different outcome and more about becoming genuinely curious about the mechanism that keeps producing the current one, not fixing the output, investigating the system that generates it. This is what the terrifying theory of quantum manifestation actually points at. When you follow it past the pop science version and into the place where physics, philosophy, and neuroscience converge, you are not failing to manifest what you want because your vibration is misaligned or your belief is insufficient. You are manifesting with extraordinary precision and consistency, exactly what your deepest predictive model expects to find. The problem is not the power of the process. The problem is the model running it. And that creates the problem this block cannot close, the one that the next part of this conversation has to face directly. Because knowing all of this, understanding the mechanism with complete intellectual clarity, changes almost nothing on its own. You can understand the prison perfectly and still be inside it. The question is not what needs to change. The question is, what has to happen to the one who needs to change? And whether after decades of a particular way of being in the world, that kind of change is still genuinely available. I want to step out of the argument for a moment, not because the argument is finished, it isn't, but because there's something that needs to be said directly, without the scaffolding of physics or philosophy or neuroscience around it. If you're in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, if you've been genuinely trying to understand yourself, genuinely trying to change the things that don't work, genuinely showing up to that effort with real seriousness and real willingness, and you're still watching certain patterns repeat, there is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes with that. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's a quiet settling, a gradual revision of what you allow yourself to expect. You stop calling it hope and start calling it realism. And that reorientation feels like wisdom. It feels like maturity. It feels like the reasonable adult response to a sufficient quantity of evidence. But there's a question worth sitting with. What if some of that evidence was generated by the filter? What if the realism is partly the model confirming itself, selecting, from the full range of your experience, the data points that support the conclusion it already holds, and quietly dismissing the ones that don't? This is not an accusation. This is the mechanism. This is what predictive systems do. In brains, in institutions, in any structure that has been optimized over time for a particular kind of output, they become very efficient at producing more of what they've already produced. The exhaustion is real. The losses are real. The decades of effort are real. None of that is being minimized here. But here is what is also real. The brain retains neuroplasticity, the capacity to form new connections, revise existing models, and update predictions based on new experience across the entire human lifespan. Not at the rate of adolescence, not without effort and repetition, but the capacity does not close. The window does not shut at 40 or 50 or 60 or beyond. What closes is not the capacity. What closes gradually is the willingness to remain uncertain long enough for something new to form. Because uncertainty is uncomfortable at any age, but after decades of building a coherent self, a consistent story about who you are, what you're capable of, what you can reasonably expect, uncertainty feels less like possibility and more like threat. The model has been refined over 50 or 60 years. It is sophisticated. It is internally consistent. It has explanations for everything, including its own limitations. And that sophistication is precisely what makes it resistant to revision. This is the specific weight that this conversation is addressing. Not the generic challenge of human change, but the particular challenge of change after a long investment in a particular way of being. The challenge of entertaining the possibility that some of what you've called wisdom is calcification, that some of what you've called acceptance is foreclosure, that the settled quality you've achieved in certain areas of your life is not peace, but the absence of the friction that would be required to move. Not in every area, probably not even in most areas, but in the specific places where the pattern repeats, where the same ceiling appears, the same relational dynamic reasserts itself, the same opportunity dissolves in the same way. In those specific places, the question is worth asking. Is this reality? Or is this the model's version of reality, presented with such consistency and such internal logic that the distinction has become invisible? Here is what I want to say directly to the person watching this who has tried, genuinely tried, and found the trying insufficient. The trying wasn't wrong. The level at which you were trying was. Changing behavior at the surface level, while the predictive model beneath it remains unchanged, is like repainting a house whose foundation is shifting. The paint looks different. The structure continues its movement. Eventually the cracks reappear, often in exactly the same places, because the force generating them was never addressed. What this conversation is pointing at is not a new technique to apply at the surface. It's a different level of engagement entirely. One that begins not with changing what you do, but with becoming genuinely, persistently curious about what you see, about the specific way your particular observer meets the world, about what your filter is optimized to find and what it is systematically blind to. That curiosity, not forced positivity, not disciplined effort, not renewed resolution, but genuine investigative curiosity about your own perceptual system, is the aperture through which real revision becomes possible. Why hasn't change worked before? Not because you lacked commitment, because commitment applied to the wrong level of the problem is ultimately commitment to the problem's continuation. But here's what that opens directly ahead. If the level of change required is deeper than behavior, deeper than conscious intention, deeper even than emotional processing, if what actually needs to shift is the predictive model itself, the unconscious observer stance, the identity level assumption about what kind of world this is and what kind of person you are within it, then what does that actually look like in practice? Not in theory, not as a philosophical position, as something a person does or becomes or allows in the specific texture of an ordinary day. That's the question this block leaves open, and it's the one the final movement of this conversation is built to close. Let's come back to the beginning. The word manifestation is wrong, not because the phenomenon it points at is false, but because the word carries none of the weight of what's actually happening. It sounds like a gift, like a technique, like something you either have the knack for or you don't. What it actually describes is something you've been doing every moment of your conscious life, with perfect consistency and zero exceptions. You have been collapsing possibility into actuality through the specific, shaped, historically calibrated lens of your particular observer stance. You have been selecting from the 11 million bits per second of available reality, the 50 that confirm the world your predictive model expects to find. You have been generating through the precise mechanism of a filter that formed before you had the language to examine it, the recurring conditions of your experience, not as a victim of fate and not as a master of intention, but as a participatory observer whose participation has been mostly unconscious. That is what manifestation actually is, not a power you need to develop, a process you need to become aware of. The loop that opened at the beginning of this conversation, the question of who has been doing the observing, closes here, and the answer is both simpler and more demanding than anything the popular version of this topic offers. The observer has been you. The part of you that formed in response to early experience, drew conclusions about the nature of reality, built a predictive model from those conclusions, and has been running that model, faithfully, efficiently, without interruption, ever since. Not the you that reads books or sets intentions or wants things to be different. The you that expects, the you that anticipates, the you that meets each new situation already knowing, at a level below conscious thought, roughly what it is going to find. That observer is not your enemy. It was built for protection. It served a function. In the environment where it formed, it may have been genuinely necessary, but you are not in that environment anymore. And the model doesn't automatically update just because the environment has changed. It updates when the organism, when you, deliberately and repeatedly encounters experiences that contradict the prediction, in conditions of sufficient psychological safety that the contradiction registers as information rather than threat, and sustains that exposure long enough for the brain's error correction system to revise the model towards something more accurate. This is what genuine change requires, not at the level of behavior, not at the level of emotional processing alone, at the level of the predictive system itself, the unconscious observer stance that determines what kind of world you step into every morning. The Stoics called the path ascesis, disciplined practice, not of behavior, but of attention, daily, unglamorous internal work of catching the judgment before it hardens into perceived reality. The Jungians called it individuation, the slow, often painful integration of what has been operating in shadow, bringing it into conscious relationship so that it no longer drives from below awareness. The neuroscientists call it experience-dependent plasticity, the brain's capacity to revise its predictive models through sustained exposure to disconfirming experience. Different maps, the same territory. And what every map agrees on, what the physics and the philosophy and the psychology and the neuroscience all converge to say, is this: you are not a passive receiver of a fixed reality. You are a participatory observer whose mode of participation has been shaped by history, and whose mode of participation can be reshaped by awareness applied with sufficient consistency and depth, not quickly, not through technique, not through 30 days of aligned vibration, through the slow, serious, genuinely courageous work of learning to see how you see, and remaining in that inquiry long enough for something older than your current model to become visible. Here is the synthesis, stated in one place. The terrifying theory of quantum manifestation is not that you can create reality with your thoughts. It is that you already are, with your observer, your model, your filter, your unconscious expectations, and that the creating has been happening without your conscious participation this entire time. The invitation, and it is an invitation, not an indictment, is to begin participating consciously, not by forcing a different outcome, by becoming genuinely curious about the observer generating the current one. That shift, from unconscious participation to conscious inquiry, is not a destination, it is a practice, and it is available to anyone willing to find it more interesting to examine their perceiver than to argue with their perceptions. The virada, the final turn, is this. The most radical act available to a person at any stage of life is not to want something different. It is to become curious about the one who keeps encountering the same thing. That curiosity is the aperture. Everything else follows from it, or nothing does. If something in this conversation landed differently than you expected, if it named something you've been circling without quite finding the words for, the most useful thing you can do right now is not subscribe or share, though both are welcome. The most useful thing is to sit with one question before the day moves on. Not, what do I want to manifest? But, what does my observer expect to find? In your closest relationship, in your work. In the version of the future, you allow yourself to genuinely imagine, what does the model predict and when did it form that prediction? That question, held seriously over time, is the beginning of the only kind of change that reaches the level where these patterns actually live. If you want to continue this inquiry, the next video goes further into the specific mechanisms of observer revision, what the neuroscience, the contemplative traditions, and the philosophical record actually agree on when it comes to changing not what you do but what you are while you're doing it. It's linked at the end of this one. And if this conversation reached something real for you, leave a comment with the one pattern you've recognized most clearly today. Not to perform insight, because naming it precisely in your own words is itself a small act of conscious participation. The observer is always operating. The only question is whether you're watching it.